Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Keegan McBride, and I'm a lecturer in AI government and policy at the Oxford Internet Institute. And as well as that, I'm an advisor here for the Auction AI conference. So I'm very happy that all of you are here today. And I'm really happy to welcome my friend, Michael Kratsios here. So Michael, if you don't know, is currently the managing director of Scale AI, which I think just raised $1 billion in their last round. But probably more importantly and interestingly, he previously served as the 4th Chief Technology Officer of the United States at the White House under the Trump administration and was the Undersecretary of Defense at the Pentagon. So during the period of Trump's presidency, Michael really spearheaded the White House and reorienting it towards a US national technology policy towards an explicit primary focus on ensuring continued American leadership in emerging tech. He's responsible for architecting the US's first AI strategy, the American AI Initiative, and the US Senate unanimously confirmed Michael as the, he was unanimously concerned, and I think he was the youngest undersecretary of defense in history. So over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to talk about things related to geopolitics, AI, regulation, and big thanks to you, Michael, for being here today. Maybe as a very first question, when you were in the White House, ChatGPT 3.0 hadn't come out yet, but there was already a lot of work going on related to AI regulation. Do you want to talk us through what was happening in these early days and maybe how the situation today is slightly different?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. My fiance actually is a graduate of Oxford, and I always try to find excuses to come here so she can show me around this beautiful campus. But you are correct. I think the debates around AI policy had started long before ChatGPT was released. And a lot of the debates, if you remember, in the sort of 2017, 2018, 2019 period were more of centered around, I think, two things. One was a horse race, national security sort of question or debate between the US and China. So are we, who is leading? Who's investing more money, who's doing the right things to sort of create a national strategy, who's going to come out on top. And the second set of conversations were really tied into a lot of this debate of the impact of automation on the workforce. So at the very tail end of the Obama administration, if you remember, in the sort of 2016 timeframe, there was a big report that was released which discussed all about sort of what are the potential impacts of AI on the economy, on workers, on the workforce, and so on. So I think when we were in government, I think what we spent a lot of time thinking about is, the U.S. does not have a national AI strategy yet. It is something that's incredibly important, and what can we do to develop one? And we spent sort of the first year and a half doing a bunch of sort of like listening, touring around the country, bringing people into the White House, and trying to like build attention around the issue. I mean, it feels kind of crazy today to say this, but it took a lot of energy to get people to care about AI at that moment. Like, it wasn't front page news, there weren't hearings on the Hill. Like, you really had to twist people's arms to say, like, this is really serious for the country, what can we do? And to President Trump's credit, he signed not one, but 2 executive orders on artificial intelligence. He released one, which was a national strategy called the American AI Initiative, and the second was an executive order around the use of artificial intelligence in government. So I would say I think there was a lot of effort done during that period, which I think we're all very proud of what we were able to accomplish, and I think set up this next administration to kind of build on all those efforts. Just a quick summary of that strategy so you kind of know where our heads were at. I think first and foremost, it was around research and development leadership. So actually, for the first time ever, accounting for the amount of federal dollars that are spent on AI research and development, and to actually double the spending of AI research over the course of 2 years, which was a really big deal back in 2019. The second was on sort of workforce-related issues. How can you use the federal government's grants and fellowship programs in order to direct people towards more AI-related secondary sort of programs? The third was around sort of regulatory issues, and we'll get into that in a second. But sort of the first ever binding regulatory guidance around artificial intelligence was released by the Trump administration in 2020. And the third was around international engagement, this understanding that we had to work with our partners and allies if we wanted to counter the threat of a aggressive CCP.
So I think in yesterday, today, there's been a lot of talk about regulation of AI. Obviously, you've been working in that space for quite a while. The UK has one model that is putting forward with a sort of pro-innovation approach. Obviously, the EU has the AI Act. China is doing a lot when it comes to the regulation of AI. The US in its current administration has the AIEO, there's the OMB guidance. So there's a lot of different models out there for the world on how to regulate AI, particularly at the cutting edge, frontier model, stuff like that. What, in your mind, is the sort of best way to think about the regulation of AI? How should policymakers be thinking about it? And what might industry, want to be thinking about in terms of what regulations might be coming down the line?
Yeah, if you're an AI policy wonk, the last 2 years have been probably one of the most thrilling roller coasters of your life. So we started with no one caring about AI regs, and then suddenly you had a bunch of sort of Silicon Valley technologists running to Capitol Hill saying that we need to create sort of a new IAEA for artificial intelligence. There were draft ideas about entire new departments or agencies at the U.S. government to sort of do all this stuff. You had Breton and the brilliant folks in Brussels deciding that they need to take charge and modify a rule they've been working on for years to somehow account for technology that they had no idea how it worked or they even understood how to use it. So I think you had sort of all these people kind of like jockeying for who could get a quote in the front page of the New York Times around kind of what the future was for AI regs. And it's been interesting to watch because you sort of had this sort of crescendo of desire for sort of these centralized regulatory apparatuses. And at least in the US, I think there's some sanity has come to the conversation and we've sort of veered away from that. And I think you could argue there's probably bipartisan consensus in Capitol Hill that the idea of a singular AI regulation is definitely untenable, and that the future of AI regulation in the United States is centered around sector-specific, risk-based approach to AI regs, meaning that so AI is going to be sort of permeate across every facet of our society, and we already have a set of agencies that cover all sorts of different use cases. So the folks at FDA, for example, are probably best suited to deal with AI-powered medical diagnostics. The people at the Department of Transportation are probably best suited to work with AI and autonomous vehicles. And I think kind of that's where we're going. Now, the second order question to that is like, do we have the skills necessary at those regulatory agencies to be able to account for these new use cases? And that's something that's going to continue to be a work in progress. But I think we pretty definitively have moved away from this sort of like centralized single rule. I think the one area that's still a little bit open to debate, and I think people are still trying to sort out what to do is, I think there's a lot of clarity, or generally in my mind, on how to think about the use of AI. The real question is, what do you do with, or if anything, with the foundation models themselves? And there was action taken by the Biden White House to essentially, now it's in rulemaking, to require any model developer that trains over a particular threshold to disclose to the federal government by law the testing that they have done for risk to the federal government. So that's, you could argue that's kind of a lightweight approach to thinking about it. If you're more on the accelerationist side, you may argue that that's a burden, that particular threshold is one that many people are going to be surpassing in the very near future. So it's not a very future-proof rule, for example. So that's kind of where we stand today. My general view is you need a sector-specific approach to it, and I think that's kind of how it's going to work out in years ahead.
Well, I think that probably resonates, at least with the public policy folks here in the UK, because this has been kind of what was outlined in this initial white paper. And more recently with the Tony Blair Institute, we put out an idea that was sort of similar in nature. But we always get this feedback, which is that, okay, but AI is actually different, particularly at the frontier. Therefore, we need AI safety institutes. We need to look at these sort of existential risk questions. And what you see are these safety institutes popping up kind of around the world. How do you get this right? What are your thoughts on it? What is the role that they have to play in this broader sort of regulatory ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think to the UK's credit and to Prime Minister Rishi's credit, I think they spent a ton of effort in sort of launching the first AI safety sort of institute in the world and trying to sort of normalize the policy priority of examining existential risk on behalf of a country. The government itself has to do that rather than the companies themselves doing it on their own. And I think there's an argument to be made that there are certain types of use cases that these models have that the government probably wants to look into. And you can imagine sort of extreme sort of biothreat issues or things related to nuclear or whatever it may be. There's lots of them. But I think what's interesting about the tone of the conversation was if you were speaking about this last year, that was the dominant thrust. That was what everyone was fixated on. That was where the regulations needed to be focused on. And I think we're sort of over time getting a little more back to sanity where, of course, the government should be thinking about these issues, but that isn't a reason to sort of hold back the entire industry as a consequence of it. And I think since the UK launched theirs, the US in great fashion showed up to the safety summit in Bletchley Park and had our Secretary of Commerce announce their own on stage at the British event. But in any case, everyone is sort of competing to sort of create their own AI safety institutes. And now the big question is, how are these going to function in a way that actually supports and promotes the AI industry rather than holds it back? And to me, I think the core thing that every one of these safety institutes needs to be thinking about is something that remains unanswered, and that is a measurement science question. If you actually dig into how you red team these models, it is not a particularly empirical process. You have some biotech experts partnered with some prompt engineers sitting together in a room, interrogating a model for a couple hours, and then writing a report and trying to get some reporter to write about how dangerous this particular model is. And that is not a repeatable, sustainable, empirically defendable way that we should be doing policy. So what I've always argued for, and I think that a lot of these safety institutes should be thinking about, is a measurement science behind these models. We need to understand how you actually can measure these models before you try to make policy around what these models can or can't do. And I think it was very telling when Dario from Anthropic went and testified to the Senate last year. He said this exact thing. You can read in his testimony. The actual measurement science around LLMs is unsettled. So if you think about back to what I said very early on, what should the federal government be spending on when it comes to AI research and development? Yes, all of these private sector companies are spending billions of dollars on these LLMs, but one area where the government can play a role is invest in this early stage pre-competitive basic research around the measurement science of LLMs. And I think the entire community will benefit from better science there.
Yeah, so yesterday we had this panel on geopolitics of AI, and I think it's kind of been a theme throughout the conference as well. The UK has the AI Safety Institute. It's trying to keep up its relevance in this field. But at the end of the day, it's basically this giant competition between the US and China, which are sort of two technical powerhouses in the AI development space. So earlier on in the first answer, you were talking about the importance of international cooperation. Obviously there are things like GPAI. Can you talk a little bit more around the sort of geopolitics of this debate that's going, or not debate, but the geopolitical competition between US and China in the AI space, and the importance of international cooperation, for example, with the UK, and then getting into why having the best standards be American, for example, is an important part of this equation.
Yeah, absolutely. On kind of the allied free world side of the equation, you have the United States that stood up its AI Safety Institute. They're trying very hard to make it sort of the prominent lead in this space. Next month, there's going to be a summit held in San Francisco that our Commerce Department of the US is going to host, where all the other safety institutes are going to come, and these conversations around cooperation are going to start. So if you think about what are models where you can get sort of the allied free world to work together, you can think of it in some ways as kind of like, I like to think of it as sort of like airplane testing. So if you're the FAA at the United States and you certify safe a particular aircraft that's made by Airbus, for example, there's sort of reciprocity. So other countries around the world agree that that is safe. They don't need to retest the plane again for use by their country's airline. And I think the US AI Safety Institute is trying to get into that category of work where you can sort of create these agreements across multiple AI safety institutes around the world, so you don't have to pretest the same model multiple times by different agencies. So I think that's good, and I think we need to sort of continue that. Now, on the other side, on kind of the authoritarian side of the world, you have a CCP that is hell-bent on creating the dominant LLM in the world today, not only for use by its own people, but trying to export that around the world. And I think the terrifying and sort of like very disturbing thing about the approach that the Chinese have taken in developing their models is the regulatory regime around it, particularly around the fact that in order for a large language model to be released for public use in China, it has to actually pass a test to ensure that it conforms with Xi Jinping thought. So they actually went and they created a test that then they use on these models to ensure that this model is actually communist and authoritarian. And then they want to take that model and they want to export it around the world. So the level of danger around this is something that we need to be very thoughtful of and not casually kind of move along with our lives and believe this isn't a new version of or new component of the digital Belt and Road Initiative.
So I kind of want to push you on this a little bit because I think sitting in this room, it's very easy to be like, to dismiss this, saying who wants their AI to be authoritarian? Like, are people actually using it? What is it about the sort of Chinese approach to, let's say, digitally enabled authoritarianism that makes it so attractive? And why is this really a threat that we should be thinking about? And how is this, dynamic influencing this greater geopolitical competition?
Absolutely. I mean, the best parallel which I have is kind of the way that the CCP approached the export of Huawei and the export of advanced communication hardware around the world. So they're very smart in understanding that at the end of the day, most developing countries around the world or the global south do not need the cutting edge Ferrari piece of technology. They just need something that works and that meets the needs of their leaders. And they went out and they subsidized Huawei around the world, and then we were stuck in this really tough position when I was in government on how do we convince all these governments to essentially rip and replace this technology with safe, trusted Western hardware. And I think what we as the West need to think very carefully about is how do we ensure that this does not happen again in this new wave of AI? And why it's particularly of concern is that the actual ramifications of these Chinese LLMs being the base LLMs used across the global south is actually pretty scary. So if you think about it, if you're a government anywhere in the world, there is a future in the very short term where you will be using large language models across all of your government services. You will have an LLM that helps people with their healthcare, their government healthcare. You will have ones that manage your property records. You will have ones that deal with your taxes. And all of this stuff, the way it will typically work is you'll have a base foundation model that is then fine-tuned on top of the specific data of the country. And there is nothing that the Chinese want more than to ensure that their large language models are the ones that are used as the base models that are fine-tuned for all these government use cases. And once that's done, then you have these entrenched LLMs that for years are going to be used in these countries around the world. So I think it's incumbent on the United States especially, because we are the home for all the greatest chips and all the greatest LLMs in the world, to help in the export of these and make them accessible to all these countries that will be targets for the Chinese.
So I think part of this is obviously the internal digitalization of states, stuff like that. You see smart cities being exported. You have the digital Silk Road. But
smart cities one is quite amusing. I wish I could brand an authoritarian use case as a smart city and get away with it.
Do you want to talk about it? I assume most people know, but I think it is an interesting because everybody focuses on LLMs like frontier models, but they're doing this with statistics basically in CCTV.
Yeah, I mean, these smart cities, not to get too off track, are essentially just massive surveillance operations. And the Chinese have done an exceptional job in being able to create kind of the best CCTV cameras in the world with Hikvision, the best these networks with Huawei. They package all this together and they essentially create sort of this authoritarian sort of cyber state that then they export under the innocuous branding of smart cities.
So I think, if we're looking sort of bigger picture as well, there's the digital Silk Road component, but there's also the sort of remilitarization of China, and a lot of this is based on AI, data, digitalization, linking up data sources. The U.S., it feels, has gotten caught off guard a little bit in the sense that, we do have, obviously lots of investment in defense, but if you read some of the reports coming out of DoD, things like that, people are scared. So what do you think is important in terms of next steps in sort of meeting, the future of conflict in this area?
Totally. I think one way to kind of think about it is sort of the macro point is the U.S. needs to continue to try to field AI-powered technologies for national security use cases as quickly as possible. We know that our core and key adversaries are doing the exact same thing, and they're doing it at a speed and a velocity which I don't think the U.S. has quite been able to catch up with. When I was running the research and engineering sort of undersecretariat at DoD, we spend roughly about $150 billion a year on research and engineering, I guess R&D for national security use cases. The amount of that's spent on AI was in sort of the low single-digit billions, even if that. So we're talking a tiny fraction of a budget that is now going to be almost $900 billion in this coming year. And yes, dollars spent are not sort of maybe the best proxy, but I think it's a good enough proxy for understanding from a perspective standpoint, how far behind we are. If you believe the thesis that, and if you just watch what's happened in Ukraine, the types of technologies that are being used are AI-powered, autonomous, attritable type of devices. These are, we want unmanned things that don't cost a lot, that we can use a lot of them up and just need to produce a lot of them. And we as a country, as the United States, are not in a position to, produce these at the volumes that we need for future conflict. And I don't think we're at a position where we've developed the advanced AI technologies that we need to kind of give our warfighters the greatest tools available yet.
So moving a little bit from the sort of like conflict dimension back into, maybe one of the two Trump EOs on AI related to public sector stuff. Obviously China is doing stuff when it comes to internal digitalization. The US, to be honest, is pretty far behind on this front. The UK has it in their mind that they're going to fix the NHS with AI. In terms of like offering a better model to the world, what do you think is important to get there? What do you think are some like key next steps to be thinking about?
Yeah, I think the government use case of AI can obviously, in theory, provide a great benefit to citizens of countries and also to the way that these agencies operate. And I think if you even hear a little bit the UK government talk about how they're going to kind of reduce government spending, some of the productivity increases, they tend to believe that maybe you can find that with AI. To me, I think it's a multi-step process, and I think the first and most important step in any of these government use cases is getting your hands around the data that you need to make these use cases possible. If you think about how large language models are made, or kind of what like the core ingredients are for LLMs, it's really just three things. It's chips, it's data, and it's algorithms. So on the chips front, I think there was someone here from NVIDIA. We know how to solve that problem. We just need to, I guess, find the money and power to get that stuff going. I think on the algorithm side, that's usually just talent, and that just requires someone to write one of these models. That's not particularly hard. I think that the bottleneck that tends to occur in driving these government use cases is around that third pillar, which is the data. It's not as simple as just pointing an LLM to a bunch of folders and suddenly you're going to have a working fine-tuned LLM. You have to make, I guess, in scale parlance, you have to make your data AI ready, and that's something that typically is not thought of in procurement discussions, and it's typically something that's always an afterthought that tends to make the project ultimately fail. Because the models themselves are the sexy piece. The chips is the easiest one for people to understand, and everyone believes that sort of the data is part of sort of this like dirty plumbing portion of the equation that you want to kind of think about later. So my advice to anyone who's thinking about these projects is you have to think about both your budgets and your strategic approach to make sure you cover all three of those.
So I think there's a lot of people in the room who are obviously experts in some aspect of AI, whether that's chips, whether that's sort of digital transformation, whether that's building frontier AI. There are those who are also doing things at a much smaller level, and they think, the geopolitical dimension doesn't concern me. I just want to build my tool and get on with it and make a profit and so on, or some other aspect of that. Do you want to talk about why this actually matters, why we should be thinking about it, why it's important, and also just for the people in the room, what are some of the things that, how can they contribute to these sorts of narratives, and why is it important?
Yeah, I think not to sort of keep going back to what I've already said before, but I think we're in a sort of global race for AI supremacy here, and the actions of the CCP are ones that we've seen over the last 20 years be that they're going to be relentlessly pursuing a leadership position in these sort of emerging technologies, no matter what the West is doing. Now, I don't think that should be like that can motivate some people. It motivates me. I think you can tell, but like, I think that's not necessarily the biggest motivator for others. But I think what's important to understand is that, I think everyone, for even being here, I think that this is one of the most transformative, will probably be the most transformative technology that we will see in our lifetimes. And what's so fascinating and so amazing about this particular technology is it impacts every industry you can think of. So what I would advise young people, especially people in university settings and others, is you need to think about the topics and the areas that you're most motivated to, and like how AI can sort of blend into those, and how AI sort of like impact that. And I think that's something that you should constantly be thinking about, because there's going to be huge opportunities ahead. I think the other thing is there's a lot of policymakers here. I think it was sort of sad to sort of read the Meta release about the fact that they were not going to be making their model available in certain parts of Europe because they didn't know if it would comply with this rule from Brussels. And like, we as the West just have to be smarter about this. This is just ridiculous. This is an image generation LLM that's like not even, it's good, but it's not like, absolutely amazing. And the fact that it can't even be used in Europe, it's just like, it's almost comical. I can't even believe it that happened. And if we're sitting here kind of hamstringing ourselves, like repeatedly, like, tying ourselves, to the floor, shooting ourselves in the foot, and not making progress in the name of safety or whatever we want to do, I think it's just generally not good for the West. So I think we have to be cautious and more realist about what these AI impacts are, and make sure that we continue. Because I think what's so amazing, I think we have to remember is, go back to the debates of 2018, 2019. There was endless articles written about how the Chinese are like leading the world, like the West isn't spending enough. We were repeatedly called out for like not being on it when it came to AI. Well, lo and behold, who is the home for the greatest GPUs in the world, and who is the home for the LLM invention? And that's the United States. And we continue to be the beacon and the leader for emerging technologies, and we need to continue to provide a regulatory environment that allows us to thrive.
So I think we're coming up near the end of the time here. Maybe I'll just ask one question and then ask you if you have any final thoughts. But, people expect AI, I think, to be quite a partisan thing, but actually there's a lot of bipartisan agreement when it comes to emerging tech, to AI, to quantum, to things like that in the US. Do you want to talk about a little bit, like where are these opportunities where you have such bipartisan agreement, and, why do you think that's important, keeping this as a sort of nonpartisan topic?
Totally. I think it's been amazing to watch. I mean, when I came to office in 2017, we essentially picked up the report that the Obama folks did, and then we kept working at it. We did our executive orders. We turned them into bipartisan legislation, creating the National AI Initiative Act, so creating an office at the White House to coordinate these efforts. Then on sort of when the Biden folks came in, none of those executive orders were repealed. They went off and worked on kind of this new executive order that had to do with LLMs. So we've sort of seen this sort of continued bipartisanship on these issues. I think that's healthy. I think as this has become more of a front page issue, I will have to admit you're starting to see some fractures there on the bipartisanship, particularly on how much you want to lean into some of the regulatory approaches. That being said, there hasn't been any like blow up fights yet on the Hill, and I think there's, again, as I said, this sort of general consensus around sector specific risk based approaches to AI regs. And to me, I think we need to sort of, if you think about what are the topics that unify Washington, the one topic that definitely does is the threat of China. And I think in some ways, AI has been kind of like interlinked with that narrative in a way that has kept it bipartisan, which has been great.
Sweet. Thank you for all of this super useful information and for sharing your thoughts with us. I mean, is there anything that we haven't covered today, like last thought, something like that you would just like to share with the audience?
No, I think it's a super exciting time for AI. We're also having a big election in the United States in a few weeks that I think is going to, whoever candidate wins, I think there's going to be slight deviations in the course of AI policy in the United States. So I think it's going to be an exciting time for the world in the months ahead.
Sweet. Thank you very much. And then I would just ask the audience to thank our speaker.
Thank you.